that removed prayer from the public schools. Of course, this was just the beginning of a long list of decisions, removing Bible reading from the school the next year, a long list of judicial decisions that displayed our country's, our government's not neutrality, but its hostility toward the Christian faith. The culminating decision was 34 years ago in 1980 in the case of Stone versus Graham. It was a case that involved the display of the Ten Commandments in a Kentucky school. Now understand, the Ten Commandments were not being taught, they were not being expounded upon. The case was, can you display the Ten Commandments in a public school? And in Stone versus Graham, the Supreme Court said, no, it is unconstitutional. And do you know what the reason was they gave for saying you cannot display the Ten Commandments? If I were to paraphrase the court's decision to you, you would think I was making it up. So let me read it to you verbatim. This is the Supreme Court. Quote, if the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps venerate, and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible state objective under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Now that is the Supreme Court. We can't put the Ten Commandments up because if we do that, school children might actually read the commandments. And if they read the commandments, they might venerate the commandments. And if they venerate and respect the commandments, God forbid, they might actually obey the commandments, and that's unconstitutional. I don't think it's a coincidence that 17 years after this ruling of Stone versus Graham, in another Kentucky school, Paducah or Heath High School in Paducah, Kentucky, in a Kentucky school hallway, a group of students gathered together by the lockers like they did every morning before school to read the Bible and to pray together. And while these students had their head bowed, a 14-year-old who had obtained a gunman walked up on these praying students and opened fire, killing 3 of the students, seriously wounding 5 of the students. And it all happened in the Kentucky school where 17 years earlier the Supreme Court said, you cannot post the words, thou shalt not kill. Do you realize 118 years earlier, before Stone versus Graham, the Supreme Court had said in its case of Vidal versus Girard's executors, the Supreme Court said, quote, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament without note or comment, be read and taught as divine revelation in the school? Its general precepts expounded, its evidences explained, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated. Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly as from the New Testament? Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's funny how the liberals leave off that last portion, the free exercise of religion. It doesn't say the free exercise of religion in the home or in the church or in the synagogue. It says the free exercise of religion, period. But then it also says Congress shall not establish a religion. Our forefathers understood what they were writing. They had been used to a country where there was a state-mandated church, a church to which everyone was forced to worship, whether they believed or they didn't believe. And they came to this country, our forefathers, with the intent of having freedom of worship. Nobody would be coerced to become a part of a state church. The Congress cannot establish a religion, but what we've allowed is for the liberals to rewrite the First Amendment. It was Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, by the way, a Reagan appointee, who changed the word establish to the word endorse. And now the standard is, if government cannot endorse a religion, it cannot do anything that shows a preference toward Christianity. Why, if you have a Christian prayer at a graduation, you have to have a Muslim's prayer, and you have to have a Mormon prayer, and you have to have equal treatment, because after all, we're America and we believe in fairness and we don't want anybody to get their feelings hurt. Ladies and gentlemen, our framers couldn't have cared less about hurt feelings. That wasn't their intent. They said, you shall not establish a state religion. It doesn't say anything about endorsing a religion. For 160 years, our court said over and over and over again, America is a Christian nation. America is a Christian nation. America is a Christian nation. Yes, we allow people of all religions to worship, but we give preference to the Christian faith. That was the foundation of our country. But I want to tell you something. A few months ago, I was standing in Statuary Hall at our Capitol for that event, Washington Man of Prayer, and the Marine Band had just finished playing the Star-Spangled Banner. And I stood up, and I'm afraid I offended a few people there. I'm not really afraid, but I think I did anyway. And I said, as wonderful as all of this is, remember this: God is no respecter of people or nations. God does not get goosebumps when he hears the Star-Spangled Banner. God does not stand up and salute when he sees the American flag. God is no respecter of people or nations. Any nation that reverences God will be blessed by God, and any nation, including America, that rejects God will be cursed by God. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the psalmist said. The second explosive decision that has weakened the moral infrastructure of our country came out of Dallas, Texas, our city of Dallas. It was the case of Roe v. Wade in 1973, the case that legalized the murder of children in the womb. And since that time, 50 million children have been butchered in their mother's womb. 50 million. As we are preaching this sermon today here in America, all of us are horrified by the account we've just been hearing this past week. The father in Georgia who allegedly allowed his 22-month-old son to stay in a hot car for 7 hours. The child in that sweltering heat suffocated while the father allegedly was sexting nude pictures of himself to women. We're horrified about that. How could a father do such a thing to his child? But as horrible as that is, it is not nearly as horrible as the 3,000 children who are butchered every day in America through the sin of abortion. Where is the outcry about that? Where is the indignation about children being murdered left and right? You know, I'm hearing it said all the time. I hear it said now, people don't care about these social or moral issues anymore. Pastor, you need to just be quiet. If we're going to win any elections in 2016, nobody wants to hear about social or moral issues. All anybody cares about is the economy. Well, let's just suppose that's true. Let's think about the economic ramifications of murdering 50 million children. Do you realize one study says if those 50 million children who were butchered in the womb, if they had been allowed to live and grow up into productive tax-paying citizens, one study says it would have added anywhere from $35 to $70 trillion to our gross national product since 1973. If we had not murdered our children, there would be no Social Security crisis, no Medicare crisis, but instead we are $17 trillion in debt as a nation. You can't kill 20% of your population without fiscal, financial repercussions. But ladies and gentlemen, the financial repercussions of abortion pale in comparison to the spiritual consequences of a nation that murders its own children. Do we really have to wonder what God is going to do to a country like America that sanctions the killing of its children? Just look back in history and see what God did to his own people, the Israelites. Many of us have been to Jerusalem, and we have seen the valley of Hinnom underneath the wall around the city of Jerusalem. In the valley of Hinnom, the children of Israel would offer their children as burnt sacrifices to appease the pagan god Moloch. Dr. Ben Carson said last week, abortion is nothing less than the practice of human sacrifice. What did God do to Israel for practicing child sacrifice? He raised up the godless Babylonians and the Assyrians to bring destruction upon God's own people. I've heard people say, why in the world would God allow these pagan Muslims to come and wreak havoc like they did on September 11th in our country? Why would God allow pagans to do that to a Christian nation? All you have to do is look and see what God's done in history. He used ungodly people, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, to bring judgment upon his own people. Or in more recent times, Nazi Germany was not just taking adults, it was taking children by the trainloads to the crematoriums. As we look at history, do we really have to wonder what God is going to do to a nation like America that sanctions the killing of the unborn? The third decision that has weakened the spiritual moral infrastructure of our country is again one that came out of Texas, one that our Attorney General I know was intimately involved in, and that is Lawrence and Garner versus Texas. This is the case that struck down our state's anti-sodomy laws. Now, I know conservatives are ambivalent about this decision. Conservatives say, no, wait a minute, do we really want the government in our bedrooms telling us with whom we can have sex and what kind of sex we want to have, and on and on and on and on? Do we really want that? But what was key about this decision was the reasoning behind the decision. Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, talked about people's sexuality being the defining aspect of who they are, and that people ought to be free to express their sexuality in whatever form it comes in. Justice Scalia, who was in the minority in that decision, said afterwards, this decision today, quote, leaves on pretty shaky ground state laws limiting marriage to opposite-sex couples. Now, that was Justice Scalia back in 2003. He was prophetic when he said those words. Because today we're seeing assault upon assault on states that try to restrict the definition of marriage to a man and a woman. And yet for 160 years, that has been the decision of our country. Listen, marriage is not a constitutional right. If marriage were a constitutional right for every American, then 15-year-olds could get married. They're American citizens. They have rights. Siblings, brothers and sisters could get married. They're American citizens. They have rights. For 160 years, we've recognized as a country that the state has the right to limit the definition of marriage for the betterment of society. In 1885, in the Supreme Court case of Murphy versus Ramsey, the Supreme Court said no legislation could be more wholesome and necessary than that which sees a family as, quote, consisting in and springing from the union of one man and one woman in the holy estate of matrimony. Why is that? We know from sociology that children don't need just a father and just a mother. They need a father and a mother. Princeton sociologist Sarah McClanahan said, if we were trying to design an environment in which a child could best thrive and succeed in life, it would be one in which the child was connected to both of its biological parents. Sounds like a family to me, doesn't it? That's what God ordained. And yes, it's true that's not always possible because of death or divorce or some other extraordinary circumstance, but government ought to promote the best relationship instead of discouraging it. Remember this, whenever you counterfeit something, you cheapen the value of the real thing. And that's the problem with legalizing homosexual marriage. We already know how this plays out. We can look at Scandinavian countries that have legalized same-sex marriage. The Hoover Institute did a study, and they found over a long period of time, countries that legalized same-sex marriage, interestingly, did not see that many homosexual couples get married. What they saw was the rate of heterosexual marriage dropped precipitously. Now, I want to be clear here. Homosexual marriage is not the only thing that has cheapened the value of marriage. Unbiblical divorce, adultery, premarital sex, they are all perversions of God's plan for sexuality and the family, one man with one woman for life. That is God's plan. Listen, my point is simply this. No nation that outlaws the mention of God in the public square, that sanctions the murder of children, that destroys